The Gainesville Shadow, the true origins of a slasher. Pop culture has a way of sanitizing real life. When most people think of the horror classic time Scream, they picture popcorn, jump scares, and a guy in a mass-produced Halloween mask taunting teenagers over a landline. It's fun. It's safe. But the real story, the actual events that made a young writer named Kevin Williamson lock all his doors and windows one night in 1990 while watching a TV special, didn't have a slick soundtrack or a neatly tied-up ending. It was quiet, it was sweaty, and it was horrifyingly real. N. Let's go back to late August, 1990. Gainesville, Florida. N. Honestly, if you've ever been to North Florida in August, you know exactly what the atmosphere is like. The humidity is oppressive. The air is so thick, it feels like you're breathing through a hot, wet towel. You have the constant, droning hum of cicadas in the oak trees, and the rattling of cheap window AC units struggling to keep up with the heat. It was move-in week at the University of Florida. The town was buzzing with the chaotic energy of thousands of students returning for the fall semester. People were dragging heavy, awkward futons up narrow stairwells, eating leftover takeout pizza out of cardboard boxes, and sifting through piles of junk mail they didn't ask for. It's a very specific, mundane kind of joy. The messy reality of starting over. In a ground floor unit at the Williamsburg Village Apartments, one 8-year-old Sonia Larson and one 7-year-old Christina Powell were doing exactly that. They were freshmen, best friends from high school, just trying to settle in to their first taste of real independence. You know that feeling? The exhaustion of unpacking, the excitement of organizing a tiny closet, deciding where to put the TV. At the time, they were just two tired girls ready for the semester to begin. N. Now, at this point, everything feels perfectly safe. When you're a teenager in a bustling college town, surrounded by your peers, you feel insulated. You don't question the structural integrity of a cheap sliding glass door. You don't think twice about the dense, overgrown strip of woods just behind the apartment complex parking lot. And which actually mattered later. N. Because just beyond the tree line, hidden among the dense palmettos and draped Spanish moss, someone had quietly set up a campsite. N at T. First, the disturbances were completely microscopic. The kind of things anyone would naturally ignore. A faint rustling in the brush near the edge of the property line at dusk. A shadow shifting just outside the glow of the amber parking lot lights. If you're a student taking out the trash late at night, you might pause for a second. You might feel a brief, irrational prickle of fear on the back of your neck, but human nature kicks in. You rationalize it. You tell yourself it's just a stray dog looking for scraps, or the wind, or your own exhausted brain playing tricks on you. You shrug it off, turn around, and go back inside to the safety of your living room. But the man sitting in those woods wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't a theatrical movie villain. His name was Danny Rolling. He was a transient, a drifter with a deeply disturbed mind, sitting in the sweltering heat, drinking stale water and sweating through his clothes. He wasn't just resting in the trees. He was watching. He was patiently studying the routines of the girls in the ground floor apartment, learning exactly when their lights went out and noticing just how vulnerable a simple glass door could really be. The transition from an ordinary August night to a living nightmare didn't happen with a cinematic jump scare. It started with a mechanical click. Down in Florida, those cheap sliding glass doors on ground floor apartments are notorious. If you know what you're doing, you don't even need to break the glass. You just wedge a tool under the frame and silently pry the door up, right off its aluminum tracks. And honestly, if you're a teenager asleep in the next room with a cheap box fan humming loudly to fight off the suffocating late summer heat, you're never going to hear it. By the time the sun came up on the 24th of August, 1990, the Williamsburg Village Apartments looked exactly the same as they had the day before. Students were walking to class, carrying heavy backpacks, complaining about the humidity, and drinking terrible dining hall coffee. But Christina and Sonia's parents hadn't heard from them. You know that very specific kind of anxiety. At first, you downplay it. You tell yourself, they're just busy. They're exhausted from moving. They're out exploring the campus. But after hours of calling, listening to the phone ring endlessly until the answering machine clicks over, that tight, cold feeling in your chest starts to take over. A wellness check was eventually called in. And when the police finally forced their way into that ground floor apartment, they didn't find a stylized horror movie set. They found a reality so profoundly gruesome, so methodically violent, that seasoned detectives had to immediately step back outside into the muggy parking lot just to catch their breath and process what they were looking at. Now, at this point, the police try to keep things quiet. That's standard procedure. You don't want to start a panic in a densely populated college town. They logically assumed this was a targeted attack. Maybe an aggrieved ex-boyfriend, or a localized burglary that had gone horribly, violently wrong. A terrible, but isolated, tragedy. But before they could even finish processing the scene, the bottom fell out of the investigation. The very next day, a 8-year-old student named Krista Hoyt didn't show up for her shift at the local sheriff's office. Police went to her duplex to check on her. Inside, they found a scene that completely shattered their initial theories. The killer hadn't just murdered Krista, he had taken his time, meticulously posing her body in a highly theatrical, deeply disturbed manner designed specifically to shock and traumatize whoever found her. Panic set in. Not a metaphorical panic, a suffocating, contagious fear that paralyzed the entire city of Gainesville. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, pepper spray, and baseball bats in a matter of hours. Students dragged their mattresses out of their bedrooms and into the center of their living rooms, sleeping in terrified groups of 10 with the lights blazing. And honestly, it was justified. Because just 2 days later, 2 more students, Manny Tabawada and Tracy Pales, were found dead in their apartment. The procedural messiness of a real investigation is that when you have a desperate, terrified public, you desperately need a suspect. The pressure from the media and the community is crushing. And almost immediately, the police found someone who fit the bill. His name was Edward Humphrey. He was an 8-year-old student who actually lived in the same apartment complex as 2 of the victims. He had a deeply scarred face from a car accident, suffered from severe, untreated mental health struggles, and had recently been acting incredibly erratic, getting into shouting matches and wandering the complex at odd hours. He was the quintessential creepy guy that neighbors whisper about. It was the perfect narrative. The town latched onto it immediately. This times was the monster. It was a false explanation, but it made total sense to a terrified community. They had a troubled, violent kid in custody, the police were publicly focusing all their energy on him, and people finally let out a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. Except, it wasn't over at all. Because as the detectives sat in their cramped, stale-smelling precinct offices, drinking day-old coffee and sifting through the horrific crime scene photos, the truth began to quietly collapse around them. The brutality of the murders, the sheer physical strength required to overpower someone like Manny Tabawada, who was a muscular college football prospect, combined with the meticulous, almost clinical cleanup of the crime scenes, did not match the profile of an erratic, disorganized teenager having a manic episode. The killer had used tape to bind his victims. He had left almost no usable fingerprints. He was literally washing his victims in the bathtub to destroy forensic evidence before slipping back into the night. Edward Humphrey was a tragic kid who desperately needed psychiatric help, but he wasn't a calculated, phantom-like predator. The chilling realization slowly washed over the task force, which actually mattered later because it meant all their early momentum was completely wasted. They had the wrong guy. And the man who had been patiently watching from the tree line, drinking stale water and quietly testing sliding glass doors, was entirely unknown to them. And he was still out there. The break in the case didn't come from a brilliant psychological profile or some cinematic shootout in the rain. It came from something painfully, frustratingly mundane. Just a few weeks later, and about 40 miles south in Ocala, a local guy tried to rob a grocery store. He botched it, fled in a stolen car, and ended up crashing. The local cops arrested him without much fanfare. His name was Danny Rolling. He was a 6-year-old drifter from Louisiana with a history of petty crime and an incredibly troubled past. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Now, at this point, nobody in Marion County thought they had just arrested the Gainesville Ripper. Why would they? He was just another sweaty, desperate guy in a holding cell, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, probably smelling like stale cigarettes and nervous sweat. At the time, this didn't seem strange. It was just another Tuesday night. Arrest is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. But back in Gainesville, the task force was finally making a physical breakthrough. Behind the university campus, hidden in a dense, humid patch of woods that students walked past every single day without a second thought, police found a campsite. It wasn't some high-tech villain's lair. It was pathetically ordinary. A damp tent, some cheap stolen tools, half-eaten junk food wrappers, and a battery-powered cassette recorder. It was the messy, dirty reality of a serial killer. He hadn't been an untouchable mastermind. He had been living in the dirt, wiping his hands on his jeans, and quietly peering through the trees at the brightly lit apartment windows. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. When crime scene technicians processed that damp campsite, they found evidence directly linking the camper to the Gainesville murders. And when they ran the serial numbers on the stolen items, it connected straight to the man sitting in the Ocala jail for a botched grocery store robbery. Danny Rolling is less than BR, is greater than, is less than. BR is greater than. The reveal of Danny Rolling completely shattered the illusion that monsters look like monsters. He was just a guy. And honestly, that was the hardest thing for the community to process. The emotional aftermath in Gainesville wasn't just heavy grief. It was a profound, lingering paranoia. For months afterward, students couldn't look at a sliding glass door without checking the locking mechanism 3 times. They couldn't walk past a line of trees on their way to class without wondering who was standing just out of sight, listening to the crunch of their footsteps. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. But the final, truly haunting detail of this case, the aftershock that still echoes into pop culture today, came from that battery-powered cassette recorder found in his dirty tent. Rolling had recorded a tape for his family. On it, amidst rambling, self-pitying apologies and weirdly casual singing, he left an auditory footprint of a man who had completely detached from his own humanity. Is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. A few years later, a struggling screenwriter named Kevin Williamson was watching a television special about Danny Rolling. It was late at night. The sheer, grounded terror of the Gainesville Ripper, the idea of a killer just watching through the window of a normal, quiet house, observing your mundane evening routine, creeped Williamson out so much that he paused the TV and went to check his own locks. As he walked through his house, he noticed an open window in his living room. He stared at it, frozen, realizing in a cold sweat how easily someone could just slip inside while he was sitting on the couch. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. That exact feeling of domestic, helpless terror inspired him to sit down and write a script. He called it Scream. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. And it's a deeply uncomfortable realization when you sit with it. We watch movies like Scream for a fun, thrilling scare, eating popcorn with our friends while a masked phantom stalks teenagers on screen. But the genesis of that phantom wasn't a fun Hollywood trope. It was a very real, very sweaty drifter, crouching in the damp Florida woods, patiently waiting for a tired college kid to forget to lock their sliding glass door. And knowing that is infinitely more terrifying. The Valley of Headless Men. Imagine a place so massive and remote that if you dropped the entire country of Switzerland into it, you'd still have room left over. Now imagine that inside this vast, beautiful wilderness, there's a specific 200-mile stretch of river that the local indigenous people absolutely refuse to go near. They call it the Valley of Headless Men. And honestly, for a long time, people just thought that was a spooky campfire legend. Just folklore to keep tourists away. Until the bodies actually started showing up. But before we get into today's strange and mysterious story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, hit the like button so hard that it drops its phone into a storm drain, and then offer to help it look, only to push it in. So, let's go back to 1904. The Klondike Gold Rush had basically ended, but that gold fever, it hadn't left people's blood. We meet two brothers, Willie and Frank McLeod. These aren't larger-than-life explorers or cinematic action heroes. They are just regular, tough, slightly desperate guys living in the Canadian wilderness, trying to make enough money to not freeze or starve the next winter. And you know how it is when you're desperate, you start listening to rumors you'd normally ignore. They hear whispers about a creek in the Northwest Territories, deep within the Nahanni River Valley, supposedly glittering with thick, raw gold nuggets just sitting in the shallow gravel. The logistical reality of this trip was an absolute nightmare. We're talking weeks of dragging heavy wooden boats up, violently freezing rapids, navigating entirely blind through these massive jagged canyons they literally just called Canyon 1, 2, 3, and 4. It was composed of grueling, deeply uncomfortable days. Waking up in damp wool, drinking stale bitter coffee boiled over wet wood, swatting away thick clouds of black flies. But they did it. In 1904, they made the arduous trip, spent a year out there in the absolute middle of nowhere, and somehow, miraculously, they actually came back to civilization with a small fortune in coarse gold. They had proven the myth was real. So, naturally, in 1905, they pack up to do it again. They load up their boats with mundane essentials, sacks of beans, flour, heavy rifles, cast iron pans, and they head back up the Nahanni River. At first, no one really worried when they didn't come back by winter. In those days, out in the deep bush, you could easily get snowed in and just have to hunker down and wait for the spring thaw. It was normal. Their family just assumed they were stuck but safe, second-guessing any lingering anxieties. At the time, this didn't seem strange. But then 1906 passed. Then 1907. 3 whole years go by. By 1908, the brothers' family is beside themselves with worry. Their other brother, Charlie McLeod, just can't take the agonizing not knowing anymore. He organizes a search party and hires a local guide. And honestly, the vibe on this trip was probably incredibly grim. Charlie wasn't looking for a rescue, he was looking for a gravesite. After weeks of fighting the exact same brutal rapids his brothers did, Charlie's crew finally enters the third canyon. The air here is notoriously dead. It's surrounded by these towering rock walls that block the wind, making the whole area eerily, uncomfortably silent. Suddenly, the guide points to the riverbank. Tucked away in a small clearing of spruce trees, they see it. A camp. As Charlie rows closer, he's probably feeling this heavy, sinking hesitation. You can imagine him gripping the oars, staring at the tree line, not wanting to actually get out of the boat. He eventually ties off the line and walks up the muddy bank. The camp hasn't been destroyed by a bear or swept away by a flood. It's just sitting there, frozen in time. Ropes are still tightly tied around the trees. 2 rusted rifles are propped up against a rotting log, completely untouched. There's a blackened coffee pot sitting over a cold 3-year-old ash pile. It's that jarring mundanity everything looks like Willie and Frank just stood up to grab some firewood and never walked back. But as Charlie steps further into the tall brush, his boot catches on something hard hidden in the overgrowth. He looks down, and the horrifying reality of what actually happened to his brothers begins to slowly unravel. Charlie looks down. Under a thick layer of damp moss and rotting leaves, he sees a decaying leather boot. He just stands there for a long time. The wind rustles the spruce branches overhead, and the faint, rushing sound of the river echoes in the background. You can imagine him swallowing hard, not wanting to pull back the rest of the overgrowth. But he has to. He gets to his knees and begins brushing away the dirt. Beneath the brush, he uncovers the skeletal remains of his two brothers, Willie and Frank. The discovery is jarring, but what makes Charlie's blood run cold is how they are positioned. One brother is still securely tucked inside his heavy wool sleeping bag. The other is sprawled out near a tree, seemingly reaching for nothing. Charlie, shaking, begins to gather their remains so he can take them home for a proper burial. And honestly, this is where the story shifts from a tragic wilderness death to something deeply sinister. As Charlie gently sweeps the dead leaves away from the top of their collars to retrieve their skulls, his hand hits empty dirt. He digs a little deeper. Nothing. He searches the entire perimeter of the campsite. He checks behind the rotting log. He checks near the cold ash pile. There are no skulls, not a jawbone, not a single tooth. Both of his brothers' heads are completely, inexplicably gone. Charlie and the guide don't stick around to investigate. They pack whatever bones they can, jump back in the boat, and row out of the third canyon as fast as the current will take them. When they finally make it back to civilization, the news spreads like wildfire, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, are forced to open an official investigation. Now, at this point, the Mounties are sitting in a warm, cramped office in Fort Simpson, sipping stale coffee and listening to Charlie's frantic report. They do what any overworked authority figure does when faced with an impossible situation. They rationalize it. They officially rule the deaths as exposure and starvation, followed by animal scavenging. The police report practically writes itself. It was wolves, they said, or bears. Scavengers take heads and scatter bones all the time in the deep bush. It was a perfectly logical explanation, and for a while, people believed it. Families in the area nodded along because it was comforting to think this was just a grim reality of nature, not a murder mystery. They downplayed the danger. At the time, this didn't seem strange. But don't let that fool you. The local trappers and First Nations guides knew the Mounties' official report was absolute nonsense. A bear might drag off a body, sure, but a bear doesn't gently untie a sleeping bag, remove a human head, and leave the rest of the skeleton perfectly intact inside the bag. But without any more evidence, the case goes cold. The truth of what happened in that canyon was buried under bureaucratic paperwork. That is, until 1917, when the RCMP's neat little explanation completely collapsed. Enter Martin Jorgensen. Jorgensen was a tough, experienced Swiss prospector. He had heard the spooky legends about the Nahanni, he knew about the MacLeod brothers, and he didn't care. He was going in. Jorgensen spends months navigating the treacherous 4-5-degree turns of the river, pushing deep into the valley. And he actually strikes gold. He sends a message out to civilization that he's hit a massive vein and is building a small cabin to stay the winter. He's ecstatic. But then, a few months go by, and the messages stop. Complete radio silence. Eventually, a search party heads up the river to check on him. When they arrive at Jorgensen's claim, the first thing they smell is charred wood. His sturdy log cabin is completely gone, burned down to the foundations, just a blackened square in the dirt. But out front, lying in the tall grass, they find Martin's skeleton. His rifle is lying on the ground a few feet away, right next to a dropped matchbook. And as the search party steps closer, they realize the most horrifying detail. Martin Jorgensen's head is completely missing. The RCMP's animal scavenger theory shattered instantly. Animals don't burn down cabins. And they certainly don't take the head of an armed man right outside his front door. Something, or someone, was actively hunting people in the Valley of Headless Men. Now at this point, the RCMP couldn't just sweep this under the rug. The animal scavenger theory was dead. You don't get a burned-down cabin, a dropped rifle, and a perfectly missing head from a bear attack. The bureaucratic wall of denial had fully collapsed, and a chilling reality was starting to set in. They had to send an actual investigator. And honestly, let's be clear about what an investigation looked like out here in the 1920s. This wasn't a modern CSI unit. This was an exhausted, overworked Mountie and a local doctor sitting in a drafty wooden outpost, drinking stale, bitter coffee out of tin cups, staring at remains spread across a rough wooden table. When the doctor examined the cervical vertebrae, the bones of Martin Jorgensen's neck, he found something that made the Mountie's blood run cold. He didn't find the crushed, splintered bone you'd expect from the jaws of a wolf or a bear. He found deep, perfectly straight, clean striations on the bone. It was the unmistakable signature of a heavy, sharp steel blade, like an axe or a machete. And when they went back to the original dusty files of the McLeod brothers, looking at the crude autopsy sketches they had previously written off, they realized the exact same clean cuts had been documented, but ignored. This is the twist that turned the Nahanni from a dangerous river into an absolute nightmare. The true horror of the Valley of Headless Men wasn't a curse, and it wasn't an animal. It was the terrifying realization that there was a very real, very human killer, or a coordinated group of them, living deep inside the 10,000 square miles of this impenetrable wilderness. And they were actively hunting people. They were watching the river, waiting. And honestly, you have to imagine the sheer, isolating terror of this realization. For the local trappers and First Nations guides, the emotional aftermath was heavy and suffocating. People stopped going to the trading posts alone. They started looking at the tree line differently. Men who had spent 30 years surviving in the freezing deep bush, men who could fight off a grizzly without a second thought, suddenly refused to go anywhere near the Nahanni. It's a very specific kind of psychological trauma when you realize the vast, empty wilderness isn't actually empty. Someone is out there, moving quietly through the canyons, taking heads as trophies. At the local Mountie station, the mood shifted to quiet dread. You'd see officers sitting in their cruisers or at their desks, surrounded by junk mail and tedious administrative paperwork, staring blankly at the map of the Nahanni on the wall. They knew they couldn't catch whoever was out there. If they sent a patrol into the 4-5 degree bends of the river, they were just serving up their own men on a silver platter. So, they effectively did nothing. They quietly marked the valley as a dead zone. But the story doesn't quite end there. Because over the next few decades, the valley would occasionally claim someone else who thought the stories were just spooky campfire legends. Which leads to one final, deeply unsettling discovery. In 1945, a miner from Ontario named John Savard went missing in the same canyon. When the search party finally located his camp, everything looked completely ordinary at first. His tent was pitched perfectly. There was a pot of long frozen coffee sitting over the cold fire pit. But inside the tent, lying in his sleeping bag, they found Savard. Like the others, his head was completely severed and missing. But it was the micro-clues at the scene that made the search party pack up and literally run to their boats. Savard's sleeping bag was zipped up tight, right to where his neck used to be. But his right hand was resting outside the thick fabric, frozen stiff in the bitter cold. Gripped tightly in his hand was his heavy revolver. It was fully loaded, with the hammer pulled back and his frozen finger still resting heavily on the trigger. Savard hadn't been ambushed in his sleep. He had been lying there in the pitch black of his tent, wide awake, weapon drawn, listening to something walking around outside his camp. He knew they were coming. And despite being armed and ready, whoever or whatever was out there still managed to get inside, take his head, and vanish back into the endless, silent trees. The 7-2, Our Wager. When a missing persons case hits a detective's desk, they usually look for the standard markers of a struggle: shattered glass, a dropped cell phone, maybe a smear of blood on the pavement. But when police found two 8-year-old Claire Vance's dark gray Honda Civic idling in the empty parking lot of a local nature reserve, there was no violence at all. The driver's side door was firmly shut. The heater was still blasting. Her purse was sitting neatly on the passenger seat, right next to a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee. The only thing out of place was a perfectly folded, heavy-stock paper card taped to the center of the steering wheel. Inside, typed in a neat clinical serif font, were 3 sentences. The game has begun. She has 72 hours to find the exit. If you try to intervene, the walls close early. Now, before we dive into the psychology of a man who treated human lives like disposable puzzle pieces, if you're the kind of person who eats a string cheese by biting directly into the center of it like a complete psychopath, go ahead and carefully detach the like button, dip it in room temperature milk, and stick it to the ceiling of your local DMV. It just feels right. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. And honestly, looking back at Claire's life, there was absolutely nothing about her that would make her a target for this kind of elaborate, theatrical nightmare. She wasn't wealthy. She didn't have a high-profile job with dangerous enemies. Claire worked as an inventory manager at a mid-sized regional logistics firm in Ohio. Her days consisted of staring at spreadsheets, drinking stale break room coffee, and driving home in the dark because it was mid-November and the sun set before 5 o'clock. She was the kind of person who kept a spare umbrella in her trunk and always double-checked that her front door was locked before going to bed. The mundane, ordinary rhythm of her life is actually what makes her case so deeply disturbing. It means this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of selection. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. The timeline of her disappearance starts on a Tuesday evening. It had been raining, freezing drizzle all afternoon, that miserable kind of Midwest weather that just sinks into your bones and makes everything look gray. Claire left the warehouse around 5:30 p.m. We know this because security cameras caught her pulling out of the employee lot, and later, detectives would trace her route, finding no deviations. She drove straight home to her duplex in a quiet, slightly older neighborhood with big oak tree and uneven sidewalks. At this point, the night feels perfectly, boringly normal. She parks in her driveway, grabs her purse, and walks up to her covered porch. But as she reaches for her keys, she notices something. There is a small, manila envelope resting perfectly in the center of her welcome mat. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. Now, most people wouldn't immediately panic at the sight of an envelope. And Claire didn't either. She assumed it was a notice from her landlord or maybe a flyer for a local landscaping company that blew up onto the porch. She picked it up, unlocked her door, and went inside. She locked the deadbolt behind her, a habit so ingrained she probably didn't even register doing it. She dropped her keys in the little ceramic bowl by the door, took off her wet coat, and carried the envelope into the kitchen. The house was quiet, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of cars hissing on the wet pavement outside. She turned on the overhead kitchen light, grabbed a butter knife, and sliced the envelope open. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Claire pulled it out and stared at it. It was a picture of her own kitchen window, taken from the outside, looking in. But it wasn't an old photo. In the picture, the overhead kitchen light was on, and she could see the back of her own head standing exactly where she was standing right now, holding the envelope. The photograph had been taken seconds ago. Is less than BR, is greater than. Is less than BR, is greater than. It's in these quiet, terrifying moments that the human brain tries desperately to rationalize. You don't jump straight to the thought that a predator is hunting you. You think, is this a prank? Did one of my coworkers follow me home? Claire froze. Her heart started a heavy, slow thud against her ribs. She didn't scream. Instead, she did that deeply human, awkward thing. She slowly turned her head toward the kitchen window, almost afraid to look, hoping the yard would be empty. The glass was dark, reflecting only her own pale face and the yellow light of the kitchen. She couldn't see anything out in the rainy yard. But then her phone buzzed on the counter. A text message from an unknown number. It read, "Good. You're paying attention. The front door is now locked from the outside. Don't try the windows. Rule number 1. You have to play." Now, if you're hearing this, you're probably yelling at the story in your head. You're thinking, break the glass. Call 911. Scream until the neighbors hear you. But honestly, true panic doesn't usually look like a Hollywood movie. It's quieter. It's heavier. Claire dropped her phone. It clattered hard against the laminate kitchen counter, and she did the only thing her stunned brain could process. She ran to the front door. She grabbed the brass handle and twisted. The deadbolt was unlocked, the knob turned freely, but the door wouldn't budge. She pushed her shoulder against the heavy wood, but it felt like pushing against a brick wall. From the other side, through the thin gaps in the doorframe, she heard the thick, mechanical clicking of a heavy-duty ratchet strap being tightened. He had strapped the exterior doorknob to the structural pillar of her porch. She was sealed in. She backed away, her breathing turning shallow and fast, and sprinted into the living room to try the front-facing window. She unlatched the lock and shoved upward. Nothing. She pushed harder, her palms sweating against the vinyl frame, but it was completely immobilized. And that's when she looked closer at the frame. Driven straight through the vinyl, deep into the wooden studs of the wall, were 4 heavy-gauge construction screws. They were new. The metal shavings were still sitting on her windowsill. He hadn't just followed her home. He had been here for hours, quietly altering her house while she was at work. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the end table, her knuckles white. She was going to smash the pane. But as she raised it, her phone, still sitting on the kitchen counter, pinged again. A second text. It echoed in the quiet house. She didn't want to look. She wanted to smash the glass. But the psychological hold was already working. She slowly walked back to the kitchen, leaving the lamp on the couch, and picked up the phone. "Look down," the message read. Claire looked down at the floorboards directly beneath the kitchen window. Tucked into the corner, half hidden behind a potted fern, was a cheap, battery-operated baby monitor. The little green power light was on. He was listening to her breathe. A third text immediately followed. "Break the glass and I come in. Play the game and you live until morning. Go to the hallway closet. Top shelf." We don't know exactly how long Claire stood there in the dark, staring at that little plastic baby monitor. But based on the forensic timeline unearthed much later, she spent the next 4 hours participating in a psychological torture chamber inside the very place she was supposed to feel safest. When Detective Eris Thorne walked into Claire's duplex 2 days later, he wasn't looking for a crime scene. It was a standard wellness check requested by her nursing supervisor after she missed 2 consecutive shifts. But as Thorne stepped through the back door, which the fire department had to pry open with a Halligan bar, the smell hit him immediately. It was a thick, metallic tang of copper mixed with the stale, sour odor of old adrenaline and sweat. Claire was gone. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. But the living room looked like the aftermath of a bizarre, ritualistic tornado. Furniture was pushed against the walls. The carpets had been meticulously rolled up, and placed in the dead center of the bare wooden floor was a digital kitchen timer, perfectly zeroed out, surrounded by a circle of 6 more Polaroid photographs. Thorne picked one up, using his pen. It was a photo of Claire, crying, holding a pair of heavy garden shears, staring at the camera. In the background of the photo, Thorne could see her own living room clock. The time was 3:14 a.m. Now, at this point in an investigation, real life is messy. Detectives don't immediately leap to the idea of a sophisticated, game-playing serial predator. They look at the statistics. And statistically, when a woman vanishes from a locked home with signs of a struggle, you look at the men in her life. Thorne and his partner canvassed the neighborhood, digging through stale coffee and junk mail back at the precinct, piecing together Claire's recent history. And they found a glaring, neon red flag. 6 months prior, Claire had broken up with a guy named Mark. Mark was bad news, a volatile construction contractor with a history of domestic disputes and a recently expired restraining order Claire had filed against him. He had the tools to drill screws into window frames. He had the ratchet straps. And just a week before Claire vanished, Mark had left a drunk, rambling voicemail on her phone, ending with the words, "You'll see what it feels like to be locked out." It was neat. It was logical. It gave the terrifying, chaotic scene at the duplex a grounded, understandable face. The detectives thought they had their guy. They dragged Mark into the fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the precinct later that night. Thorne laid out the photos of Claire's barricaded house. Mark was sweating profusely. He was shaking, stumbling over his words, and avoiding eye contact. He was acting exactly the way a guilty man acts when the walls are closing in. Thorne leaned over the table, pressing him, waiting for the confession to spill. But here's the catch. And it's the kind of procedural wall that haunts investigators. Mark wasn't sweating because he kidnapped Claire. He was sweating because he was a mid-level amphetamine distributor who thought Thorne had just busted him for a drug run. When Thorne finally pushed hard enough, Mark cracked, but not about Claire. He gave up his alibi, terrified but desperate to avoid a murder charge. Mark had been sitting in the back room of an illegal poker game behind a strip mall 80 miles away on the night Claire disappeared. The police pulled the security footage from the alleyway. And there was Mark, smoking a cigarette on camera at the exact moment the Polaroids of Claire were being taken in her kitchen. Thorne sat at his desk, staring at the security stills, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The clean narrative collapsed entirely. Mark was a dead end. This wasn't an angry ex-boyfriend. This wasn't a crime of passion. And as Thorne sat there, rubbing his tired eyes, his desk phone rang. It was dispatch. They had another scene. Across town, in a wealthy, gated suburb, a landscaper had just found his client's front door strapped shut from the outside. Thorne felt all the blood leave his face. He realized they weren't dealing with a stalker. They were dealing with a ghost who was just getting started. And this time, when Thorne arrived at the second house, he found out what happens when a victim refuses to play the game. And honestly, this is the moment in the timeline where the case shifted from a localized tragedy into a full-blown nightmare. It's the point where seasoned cops stop trusting their own instincts. Now at this point, Thorne was running on stale coffee and pure adrenaline. He pulls into this neighborhood called Oak Creek. It's the kind of pristine, heavily governed subdivision where the biggest neighborhood crisis is someone leaving their trash cans out a day too long. It's 9 a.m. The sky is a brilliant, ignorant blue. A rogue lawn sprinkler is lazily ticking back and forth across a perfectly manicured yard. The mundane reality of the environment actually made the whole thing feel so much worse. The landscaper, a college kid holding a rake, was sitting on the curb, pale as a sheet, just pointing a trembling hand at the front door. And there they were. Two heavy yellow ratchet straps bolted directly into the brickwork, holding the front door flush against the frame. Same hardware, same method. Thorne and his partner cut the straps and drew their weapons. The smell hit them the second the door cracked open. It's that horrible, unforgettable mix of stale air, Glade plugins, and the sharp, metallic tang of deep arterial blood. The victim was a 42-year-old tax attorney named David Hirsch. But unlike Claire's house, which was eerily neat, David's house was a war zone. Lamps were shattered. The drywall in the hallway was punched in. A heavy, iron fire poker lay bent on the carpet. David hadn't just waited patiently. He had refused to play whatever sick game this ghost had set up. He had fought back. They found him lying in the hallway, connecting the kitchen to the back patio. The sliding glass door behind him was completely shattered. At first glance, the narrative seemed obvious. The detectives logged it as a frantic escape attempt. They assumed David tried to smash his way out into the backyard, and the killer caught him from behind. It made sense. At least it made sense for about 20 minutes. But this is where the procedural messiness of real police work rears its head. Thorne knelt down by the sliding glass door and looked at the shards. The glass wasn't on the patio. All the broken glass was pushed inward, scattered across the kitchen tile. The door hadn't been broken from the inside. Someone had smashed it from the outside to get in. And when Thorne looked closer at the latch, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The door was already unlocked. The clean narrative collapsed entirely. If the killer broke in from the backyard, why did he strap the front door shut from the outside? It took Thorne 3 hours to find the answer, and it came in the form of a piece of evidence so mundane it almost got overlooked. While canvassing the front yard, checking the mulch for footprints, Thorne noticed a black plastic bag tucked behind a rhododendron bush directly beneath the front window. Inside the bag was an old, cheap, scuffed-up Sony cassette player. It was wired to a pair of bulky, battery-powered external speakers. Thorne put on latex gloves, rewound the tape, and hit play. For the first few seconds, there was just tape hiss. And then, deafeningly loud through the speakers, came the grinding, unmistakable sound of a power drill. Then, the heavy thud of boots on a wooden porch. Then, the rhythmic, metallic crank, crank, crank of a ratchet strap tightening. Then, a man's voice, muffled and angry, swearing as he supposedly rattled the front doorknob. Thorne froze. He stopped the tape. He played it again. And then, the terrifying, brilliant cruelty of the trap finally dawned on him. The killer wasn't standing on the porch terrifying his victims. He wasn't a voyeur. He was a trapper. He had simply planted the tape recorder in the bushes on a timer. The terrifying noises of the house being barricaded, the drills, the footsteps, it was all pre-recorded audio. It was a hunting blind. The killer uses the audio to simulate a violent break-in at the front of the house. The victim wakes up, absolutely paralyzed with fear. They hear someone drilling their front door shut. What is the natural, unavoidable human instinct? You back away from the noise. You retreat. You slowly backpedal down your hallway, eyes locked in terror on your front door, retreating into the deepest, darkest, supposedly safest part of your house. But while the tape is playing loudly on the front porch, drawing all of the victim's panicked attention, the killer is already inside. He had slipped in silently through an unlocked back window hours earlier. He wasn't trying to break in. He was just standing in the dark at the end of the hallway, waiting for you to slowly, blindly back right into him. Thorne had to sit down on the curb. His mind flashed immediately back to Claire's house. He thought about those scattered Polaroids. The final, blurry photo of her dark hallway. She wasn't taking a picture of an intruder. She was taking a flash photograph to see if the front door was secure, backing away from the phantom noises on her porch, holding a kitchen knife, completely unaware that the killer had already stepped out of her bathroom right behind her. The emotional toll of that realization of Claire's absolute, agonizing vulnerability in her final moments hung over the department like a suffocating blanket. The houses would eventually be cleaned, the straps removed, the neighborhoods returning to their quiet routines, but the psychological rot remained. And the final detail, the one that still keeps Thorne awake at night, came a week later when the audio forensics lab cleaned up the cassette tape found in David's bushes. They listened to the whole 45-minute recording. It was just an endless, looping loop of terrifying break-in sounds. But right at the 43-minute mark, the sound effects abruptly cut out. There was 10 seconds of dead, static air. And then, a calm, deeply ordinary male voice leaned right into the microphone. It didn't sound like a monster. It sounded like a neighbor asking to borrow a shovel. He just whispered, "You can turn around now." The late shift at Register 4. There is a piece of security footage from a 2-4-hour supermarket in a quiet Ohio suburb that local police still use in their training seminars today. On the surface, the grainy, black and white video shows absolutely nothing illegal. It is just a man standing at Register 4 purchasing 3 items at 2:14 inches the morning. He buys a roll of heavy-duty trash bags, a gallon of concentrated bleach, and a generic birthday card. And honestly, if you have ever worked a graveyard shift in retail, you know that people buy weird, seemingly disconnected combinations of things all the time. At first glance, he just looks like a tired dad running a late-night errand. But it isn't what the man is buying that makes this footage so deeply disturbing. It is what he leaves behind on the little black counter right next to the credit card reader. Because that single, the mundane object would end up breaking wide open, one of the most chilling and gruesome missing persons cases in the state's history, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. But before we get into the deeply unsettling reality of what was actually happening that night, We need to understand the environment where this all started. The year was 2017. The setting was a massive warehouse-style grocery store in a town where nothing ever really happened. It was the kind of town where the biggest news was usually a high school football score or a dispute over a new stoplight. And working the late shift that night was a 22-year-old cashier named Chloe. Chloe was a nursing student, and she was one of those deeply hardworking, imperfect, relatable people just trying to keep her head above water. She had recently been dealt a massive financial blow when her old sedan's transmission gave out, so she was picking up extra overnight shifts just to pay for the repairs. Needless to say, she was utterly exhausted. The store at 2 a.m. was a surreal, liminal space. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the ambient sound of the commercial refrigeration units hummed like a giant sleeping beast, and the air always smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. Chloe was standing behind her register, shifting her weight on aching feet, sipping a lukewarm energy drink, and just waiting for the clock to hit 6 a.m. so she could go home to her cat and her warm bed. She wasn't looking for a hero moment, and she certainly wasn't expecting to come face to face with a monster. She was just bored. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than now. At this point, the automatic sliding doors up front groaned open, letting in a thick gust of humid July air. A man walked in. He was wearing a faded, oversized gray fleece jacket, which actually mattered later because it was unusually warm outside for a heavy jacket like that. But at the time, this didn't seem strange to Chloe. She just assumed he was cold from blasting his car's air conditioning. The man kept his head down, meandering through the aisles with a slow, almost robotic pace. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't acting frantic. He spent almost 10 minutes just standing in the cleaning aisle, staring blankly at the shelves. Eventually, he approached Chloe's register. He didn't make eye contact. He just stared at the little digital screen displaying the prices. Chloe scanned the trash bags. Beep! She scanned the bleach. Beep! She scanned the birthday card. Beep. The man handed her a crisp, slightly damp $50 bill. And this is where the very human hesitation comes in. As he handed over the money, Chloe noticed the man's hands were trembling. Not just a little bit, but visibly vibrating. And there was a faint, metallic smell coming off of his clothes, something coppery and sharp that cut right through the sterile smell of the floor wax. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than, BR is greater than. She paused for a split second, feeling a tiny, inexplicable knot of discomfort form in her stomach. But, like most of us would, she immediately second-guessed herself. She rationalized the fear away, telling herself that maybe he just had a medical condition, or severe anxiety, or had been working a weird late-night construction job. She forced a polite retail smile, gave him his change, told him to have a good night, and he walked away without saying a single word. He left the store, disappearing into the dark, empty parking lot. It was only after the sliding doors closed that Chloe looked down at the bagging area to wipe down the counter. There, sitting right next to the receipt printer, was a small, plastic grocery loyalty rewards card. He must have dropped it when he fumbled with his damp cash. Chloe sighed, picked it up, and swiped it through her register keyboard, figuring she would just check the account name so she could log it in the lost and found binder. But when the green text popped up on her monitor, her heart completely stopped in her chest. The screen didn't say, "Welcome back, John," or "Welcome back, David." The screen read, "Welcome back, Emily Thorne." And even though Chloe was just a tired college student who rarely had time to watch the local news, she knew exactly who Emily Thorne was. Because Emily Thorne was the 28-year-old mother whose face had been plastered on every single missing person poster in the county for the last 4 days. Now, at this point, you have to put yourself in Chloe's shoes. It's 2:15 inches the morning. The store is practically a tomb, perfectly quiet except for the low, vibrating hum of the refrigerated beverage coolers. Chloe didn't scream. She didn't drop to her knees in dramatic shock. She just froze. She stood there staring at the glowing green text on her monitor, her brain completely short-circuiting. After what felt like an eternity, the register beeped, timing out the transaction screen. That harsh, digital sound finally snapped her out of it. She picked up the store phone and paged her shift manager, Marcus. Marcus was a 20-something guy who spent most night shifts hiding in the back office, doing inventory, surviving on stale cigarettes and cheap energy drinks. When he finally trudged up to the front, looking annoyed, Chloe didn't even speak. She just pointed a shaking finger at the screen. Marcus squinted at it. "Emily Thorne," he muttered, aggressively rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Like the woman from the news?" Chloe nodded slowly. They both instinctively looked up, staring through the glass doors toward the parking lot. It was completely empty. Just a couple of stray, rusted grocery carts and the rhythmic flickering of a dying street lamp. The silence felt incredibly heavy. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Marcus, being the manager, tried to instantly rationalize the situation. He walked over, locked the front sliding doors, turned back to Chloe, and offered a perfectly logical, albeit tragic, explanation. "Look," he said, keeping his voice low. "It's gotta be her husband. David, right? I saw him on the local news yesterday. The guy is a total wreck. People do weird things when they're out of their minds with stress. He probably hasn't slept in 4 days. Buying trash bags and bleach, he's probably just manic, stress cleaning the house in the middle of the night to feel like he has some sort of control over his life. And the birthday card? He's probably just trying to keep things normal for their kid. And honestly, if you were standing in that brightly lit, sterile grocery store in the middle of the night, you would want to believe that, too." Chloe felt a massive wave of relief wash over her. It made perfect sense. It was just a grieving, terrified husband doing strange things in the pitch black of night. The trembling hands? Extreme anxiety. The damp $50 bill? He was sweating from the panic. She almost reached over to clear the prompt on her screen and throw the plastic card in the lost and found binder, is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. But then she remembered the smell. That sharp, coppery scent that had cut straight through the artificial lemon floor wax. And the fact that the man didn't seem frantic or panicked like a grieving husband, he had moved with a slow, deliberate, almost mechanical pace. Chloe shook her head. She told Marcus she wasn't comfortable just letting it go and insisted they call the police. Just the non-emergency line. Just a standard welfare check. Marcus rolled his eyes a little, muttering something about having to fill out an incident report, but he agreed. About 20 minutes later, a single patrol car rolled up to the curb. No sirens, no flashing lights, just 2 exhausted beat cops walking in from the cold. One of them, Officer Miller, was holding a half-empty foam cup of coffee. He listened to Marcus's stressed husband theory, nodding slowly, not seeming particularly alarmed at all. "All right," Miller said, his voice gravelly and flat. "Let's take a look at the security tape. Just to be sure, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than." They all crammed into the tiny, messy security office in the back. The air in there smelled like ozone and old carpet. Marcus rewound the digital tape, the footage playing back in that clunky frame-by-frame way that cheap security cameras do. They watched the man walk down the cleaning aisle. They watched him approach the register. Miller leaned in closer to the dusty monitor, the harsh blue light washing over his tired face. As the man on screen reached into his pocket to pull out the cash, his heavy winter coat shifted open just a fraction of an inch. Miller sighed. A heavy, deeply exhausted sound. "That's not David Thorne," he said quietly. Marcus frowned. "How do you know?" "Because," Miller replied, his voice dropping all of its casual warmth, "David Thorne is currently sitting in a holding cell at our precinct. He's been there for 14 hours. He turned himself in yesterday afternoon on a bench warrant just to hide from the press. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The cramped room went dead silent. The false explanation, the comforting, logical safety net they had just built, completely collapsed in a matter of seconds. Miller pointed a thick finger at the frozen frame on the monitor. Zoom in on his chest. Underneath the coat. Marcus fumbled with the mouse. The image pixelated, then sharpened, just enough. Underneath the heavy jacket, the man wasn't wearing a t-shirt or a sweater. He was wearing dark blue scrubs, the kind a nurse or a medical orderly wears. And honestly, this is where the mundane details turn into absolute nightmare fuel. Chloe suddenly remembered the birthday card. She reached into her apron, pulled out her crumpled copy of the receipt, and looked at the itemized barcode description. It wasn't just a generic card. It was a happy 8th birthday daughter card. Emily Thorne's little girl had just turned 8, the exact day before she went missing. The man in the scrubs wasn't the husband. But he had Emily's loyalty card, he knew it was her daughter's birthday, and he had just bought industrial bleach and heavy-duty trash bags. Miller didn't say another word. He just set his coffee cup down on the desk, unclipped the radio from his shoulder, and called it in. In an instant, the quiet, boring grocery store was no longer just a late-night retail shift. It was ground zero. Within half an hour, that quiet, fluorescent-lit grocery store parking lot was completely transformed, but not in the way you'd expect. There were no sirens, no flashing red and blue lights painting the neighborhood. It was just a steady, silent arrival of unmarked sedans pulling into the empty spots. Detectives in wrinkled suits stepped out, smelling like stale coffee and damp wool, their faces drawn and exhausted. And honestly, that quietness is so much more terrifying than the chaos you see in movies. It makes the horror feel incredibly real. Is less than BR is greater than? Is less than BR is greater than? While Marcus sat frozen in the manager's office, Miller had a tech pulling the exterior security feeds. At the time, they were just hoping to catch a glimpse of the guy walking to his car. And it took them almost an hour of scrubbing through grainy, jumpy footage, but they finally caught a break. A secondary camera, one that usually just monitored the loading dock, had a slightly misaligned angle. It caught the far edge of the lot. There, bathed in the orange glow of a distant street lamp, was a faded white 2004 Ford Econoline van. No windows in the back? Is less than BR? Is greater than? Is less than BR? Is greater than? Now, at this point, you might be thinking the police had everything they needed. But investigations are messy. They couldn't get a full license plate, just the first 3 letters, and a partial logo on the side of the van. But Miller was a bulldog. He got a state trooper to cross-reference the partial plate with commercial vehicles registered to local medical supply and disposal companies. And by 3 a.m., they had a hit. The van belonged to a third-party biohazard disposal contractor. The man assigned to drive it was a 4-1-year-old guy named Gregory Vance. His job was incredibly mundane. He drove around the county, emptying sharps containers and picking up biological waste from small dental practices and outpatient clinics. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than, which actually mattered later because Emily Thorne, the missing mother, worked as a receptionist at one of those exact dental clinics. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. By 4:30 a.m., a tactical team was staged down the street from Vance's duplex. You brace yourself for a shootout, for a dramatic climax. But again, reality is usually just deeply anticlimactic and sad. When SWAT breached the door, they didn't find a criminal mastermind waiting in the shadows. They found Gregory Vance sitting in his recliner in a stained white undershirt, eating a bowl of generic cornflakes, and watching a late-night infomercial. He didn't even drop his spoon. He just blinked at the officers, a look of mild, annoyed confusion on his face. He surrendered without a single word. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. It wasn't until the crime scene techs opened the detached garage out back that the true nightmare began. The smell hit them first, a thick, chemical burn of industrial bleach mixed with something cloyingly sweet and deeply wrong. Inside, they found the heavy-duty trash bags. They found the blue scrubs. And, tragically, they found what remained of Emily Thorne. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. But the real twist of this story, the detail that makes this case so utterly, stomach-churningly evil, didn't come from the garage. It came from Vance's kitchen. While searching his drawers, a detective found a simple cardboard shoebox. Inside were dozens and dozens of plastic grocery store loyalty cards. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. At first, investigators thought these were trophies. A lot of killers take tokens from their victims, right? But the truth was so much more pathetic and disturbing. Gregory Vance wasn't keeping trophies. He wasn't playing a psychological game with the police by deliberately using Emily's card at the store. He was just incredibly, obsessively cheap. He had stolen the loyalty cards from the purses and wallets of his victims for one simple reason: to use their accumulated grocery points to get a discount on the bleach, lye, and heavy-duty trash bags he needed to dispose of them. He used Emily's card that night simply because he wanted the $2.50 discount on the cleaning supplies. And the happy 8th birthday daughter card he bought? He didn't buy it to mock her family. He just grabbed the closest card on the rack to hit the store's $25 minimum purchase requirement to trigger a double points coupon. It meant absolutely nothing to him. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The emotional aftermath of a case like this doesn't just go away when the killer is caught. It leaves a dark stain on everyone involved. For Chloe, the trauma was permanent. She quit her job the very next morning. For months afterward, she couldn't even walk into a supermarket. The harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of fresh produce, the cheerful mechanical beep of a barcode scanner, it would instantly trigger a severe panic attack. She was deeply haunted by the fact that she had looked pure evil in the eye, scanned his items, and politely told him to have a good night. She had unknowingly facilitated the cleanup of a murder, all wrapped up in the perfectly normal, everyday script of retail customer service. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. But there's one final, chilling detail that stuck with Officer Miller long after Gregory Vance was sentenced to life in prison without parole. A detail that still keeps him awake on quiet, rainy nights. It was the crumpled receipt that Chloe had printed out. When the police logged it into evidence, Miller took a long, hard look at the bottom of the slip. Right below the barcode, in cheerful, automated text, it read, "Congratulations! You saved $4.80 today." And right beneath that was the lifetime points balance on the account. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than Emily Thorne had only signed up for her loyalty card 3 months ago. But the receipt showed a lifetime accumulation of over 42,000 points. To get that many points, you would have had to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on groceries over several years. Which meant Vance wasn't just using Emily's card. He had somehow merged the accounts of multiple stolen cards into one master profile, pooling the points of people who had quietly gone missing over the last decade just to save a few dollars on their own disposal. Emily was the one whose missing person report finally got him caught. But staring at that impossible point balance, Miller realized she was far, far from the first. Top 5 Bingeable Scary Stories. Death Trip Edition. 1. The Hook. You know, there is a reason we love road trips. It is the illusion of freedom. The idea that you can pack your life into a trunk and outrun whatever is stressing you out. But the story I am about to tell you, it ends in a way that is so profoundly disturbing, I actually debated leaving it off this list entirely. It involves a 500-mile stretch of empty asphalt, a deeply unsettling discovery, and a single, quiet mistake that a perfectly normal couple made without even realizing it, which actually mattered later. Before we get into the passenger seat of this nightmare, please kindly remind the like button that its extended warranty has expired by tossing a cinder block through its windshield. Now, let's get into it. 2. Normal world setup. It was late July, and the heat radiating off Interstate 40 was thick enough to warp the horizon. Mark and Elise Davis, a couple in their late 40s from Ohio, were on day 3 of their cross-country vacation. They had recently purchased a 2014 Ford Explorer, and the trip was supposed to be a slow, boring crawl toward the Grand Canyon. And honestly, for the first 2 days, it was exactly that. Boring. They drank stale, lukewarm gas station coffee, listened to hours of crackly AM sports radio, and sat in comfortable, mundane silence. Mark was the kind of guy who kept a meticulous log of their gas mileage on a little yellow notepad. Elise spent most of the drive with her feet on the dashboard, fighting a losing battle against a stiff neck from a cheap travel pillow. There was nothing cinematic about them. They were just normal. Now, at this point in a trip, the highway starts to feel like a living room. You let your guard down. You stop paying attention to the cars around you, assuming everyone else is just another tired traveler trying to get to the next Motel 6. 3. First disturbance. At around 3 p.m., somewhere just past the Arizona border, Elise asked Mark to pull over. She needed to stretch her legs, and the iced tea from 2 hours ago was catching up to her. They pulled into a completely unremarkable rest stop. It wasn't one of those creepy, abandoned horror movie locations. It was just a sun-beaten concrete slab with overflowing trash cans, a humming vending machine, and a couple of sleepy long-haul truckers parked in the back. Mark decided to stretch his legs, doing that casual, hands-on-hips walk around the car to check the tires. It is a dad thing. Muscle memory. But as he crouched by the rear passenger tire, something caught his eye. Wedged deep inside the wheel well attached to the metal strut was a heavy, black, reinforced plastic box. It looked like a pelican case, about the size of a thick paperback book held in place by industrial zip ties. At first, Mark did not panic. That is the thing about real life. When we see something bizarre, our brains immediately try to rationalize it. He figured it was some weird aftermarket part left over from the previous owner, or maybe a mechanic's stash box that had somehow gotten kicked up from the road. He dug a multi-tool out of the glove box, sawed through the thick plastic zip ties, and pulled the box free. It was surprisingly heavy. He walked over to Elise, who was returning from the restrooms, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Look what I found stuck under the car," he said, shaking it lightly. There was a dull thud from inside. It was secured shut, with a heavy padlock, and at the time, this didn't seem dangerous. It just felt like a weird puzzle. A mild annoyance on a boring Tuesday afternoon. But as Mark tossed the locked box onto the back seat and pulled out of the rest area, they had no idea they had just stolen something very, very important from someone who had been quietly trailing them for the last 300 miles. For the next 50 miles, the drive was completely ordinary. The AC was struggling against the late afternoon sun, the radio was playing a static-filled country station, and the heavy black box sat harmlessly on the back seat, wedged between a cooler and Elise's duffel bag. But about 20 miles past the rest stop, Mark started checking his rearview mirror a little too often. A vehicle had merged onto the highway behind them. A dull, slate-gray Ford F-150. It had a camper shell over the bed, heavy tinted windows, and a thick layer of dried mud obscuring the front license plate. At first, Mark didn't say anything to Elise. And honestly, why would he? You don't want to be the guy who ruins a road trip by being paranoid. He just adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, took a sip of lukewarm coffee, and tried to focus on the road. But every time he sped up to pass a slow-moving semi, the gray truck sped up. Every time he dropped his speed to 55, the truck held its distance perfectly. Always 3 car lengths back. Always matching their rhythm. Elise finally noticed. She looked up from her phone, rubbing her stiff neck, and saw Mark's eyes darting to the mirror again. The silence in the car had shifted. It was no longer the comfortable silence of a long drive. It was tight and anxious. "What is it?" she asked. Mark sighed, leaning back into his seat, projecting a calm he didn't actually feel. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder. "I think we're being followed by a repo guy." Now, at this point, that explanation made a weird kind of sense. Mark had bought their used Subaru from a sketchy, independent buy-here, pay-here dealership outside of Reno a few years back. Those places are notorious for hiding GPS trackers and kill switches in the wheel wells of cars in case the buyer defaults. Mark convinced himself and Elise that the black Pelican case wasn't anything sinister. It was just a heavy-duty tracker. The guy in the gray truck was just an aggressive skip tracer waiting for them to park for the night so he could legally hook the car and tow it back across state lines over some clerical error. It was annoying. It was an invasion of privacy. But it wasn't dangerous. They actually spent the next hour venting about predatory lending and shady car lots. They practically laughed about it, shaking their heads at the absurdity. The false comfort of a logical explanation is a powerful thing. It lets you ignore that primitive lizard part of your brain that is quietly screaming at you to run. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the desert asphalt, the Repo Man theory started to unravel. They needed gas, so Mark pulled into a sprawling, brightly lit Love's Travel stop. It was a massive place, dozens of pumps, humming neon signs, families buying road snacks, safety in numbers. Mark parked at pump 7, unbuckling his seatbelt. He fully intended to get out, walk over to the gray truck, and confront the driver. He was going to show them the digital title on his phone and tell them to back off. But the gray truck didn't pull up to the pumps. It didn't park in a tow-ready position near the building. Instead, it crawled slowly to the furthest, darkest edge of the massive parking lot. The driver killed the headlights and slipped the truck into the deep shadows behind a row of idling, unattended semi-trucks. It just sat there, pointed directly at them. Which actually mattered later because it forced Mark to realize something chilling. Real repo guys are loud. They are aggressive. They want the vehicle, and they want to get out. They don't stalk you in the dark. Elise felt a sudden, icy knot form in her stomach. While Mark stood frozen by the open driver's door, staring out into the darkness of the lot, Elise reached into the center console and grabbed Mark's multi-tool. She climbed into the back seat and yanked the heavy black box into her lap. She wasn't waiting for a mechanic or a dealership to explain this anymore. She jammed the thickest blade of the multi-tool between the cheap brass padlock and the reinforced plastic latch. She pried at it frantically, scraping her knuckles, cursing under her breath. With a sharp, violent times crack, the plastic hinge gave way. She popped the dual latches and pulled the lid open. And that was the exact moment the bottom fell out of their world. There was no wiring inside. No blinking GPS light. No magnetic mount. Inside, nestled in precisely cut, high-density acoustic foam, was a coiled length of heavy-duty steel wire, a hunting knife with a serrated edge, a roll of silver duct tape, and a small, spiral-bound notebook. Elise opened the notebook, her hands trembling so violently she could barely turn the pages. It wasn't a manual. It was a handwritten log. It was a meticulously detailed, hour-by-hour journal of their entire road trip. It listed their gas station stops, what they ate for lunch, the license plates of cars they parked next to. It described the clothes Elise was wearing 3 days ago, 5 states away. They weren't being tracked by a piece of technology. They were being hunted. And honestly, this is the part where most people would just freeze. Elise sat in the back of her own car, the harsh, buzzing neon lights of the Love's Travel stop illuminating the pages of that small spiral notebook. The smell of gasoline and stale black coffee was thick in the air. At first, she couldn't process what she was looking at. The handwriting was neat, clinical. It didn't just list their license plate. It listed the yellow cardigan she wore in Ohio. It listed the exact time Mark bought a terrible gas station hot dog in Missouri. They weren't being tracked by a piece of technology. They were being hunted by a human being. Now, at this point, if you ever find a weird, locked, military-grade box zip-tied under your car, do not try to solve the mystery yourself. Just politely hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and call the police before the tow truck gets you. Because while Elise was staring at that notebook, something outside shifted. The gray tow truck, which had been idling in the pitch-black shadows behind the semi-cabs, suddenly roared to life. The headlights didn't just flick on, they erupted into blinding, high-beam LED bars, illuminating Mark, who was still standing by pump 7 like a deer in the headlights. Realization hit Elise like a physical blow. She screamed. Not a cinematic, dramatic scream, but a guttural, panicked bark. "Get in!" Mark dropped the heavy gas nozzle. It clattered against the concrete. He didn't ask questions. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and stomped the gas. The car tore out of the station, tires squealing against the pavement. Behind them, the gray truck didn't rush. It just rolled slowly out of the shadows, its massive grille crossing over the illuminated pavement, watching them go. Mark merged onto the interstate at 90 miles an hour, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. Elise was on the phone with 911 immediately, her voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask her to repeat herself 3 times. The state troopers met them 20 miles down the highway, intercepting them at a brightly lit way station. The gray truck never showed up. And this is where the procedural messiness of real life sets in. There was no grand shootout. No cinematic confrontation. Just a sterile, freezing cold police substation at 3 a.m. Mark and Elise sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, sipping lukewarm, metallic-tasting water from paper cups, waiting while an exhausted, heavy-set detective bagged the black box, the hunting knife, the steel wire, and the notebook. The detective didn't look heroic. He just looked deeply, profoundly tired. When he finally sat down across from them, he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He explained that real repo guys don't hide in the dark. But serial predators do. He told them that over the last 4 years, along this specific stretch of Interstate 80, 3 different couples had vanished, leaving their abandoned cars idling on the shoulder. In 2 of those cases, witnesses had reported seeing a gray, unmarked tow truck in the area. The police had assumed the truck was towing the disabled vehicles. They never considered that the truck was actively hunting them, waiting for a breakdown or causing one. But then, the detective flipped to the very last page of the notebook, the page Elise hadn't had time to read. He slid it across the metal table. The ink was fresh. It was written barely 20 minutes before they arrived at the police station. It read, "Love's Travel Stop. Pump 7. She finally opened the box. The killer didn't just want them to find it. The box was a psychological tool. He had been sitting in the dark, watching her pry it open, waiting for the terror to set in before he made his move. The emotional aftermath of something like that doesn't just fade. It ruins you. Mark and Elise didn't finish their road trip. The state police escorted them to a nearby motel, and the next morning they booked a flight home, leaving their car impounded as evidence. The police never found the gray truck. They ran the handwriting, pulled security footage from the gas station, and chased down dozens of dead-end leads. But the truck had no plates, and the driver never stepped out of the cab. For months, Elise couldn't sleep. Every time a large diesel engine rattled past their house, she would freeze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She sold her car. She refused to drive at night. Which actually brings us to the final, horrifying realization of the entire case. About 3 weeks after they got back, Elise was finally unpacking the last of her luggage, a canvas duffel bag that had been locked in the trunk of their car for the entire trip. Deep inside the bag, tucked between 2 folded shirts, she found a photograph. It was a Polaroid. It showed Mark and Elise fast asleep in their hotel bed on night 3 of the trip. Elise suddenly remembered how their hotel door had felt slightly stuck that morning. At the time, this didn't seem strange. Just a cheap motel lock. But looking at the photo, her blood ran cold. The tow truck driver hadn't just been following them on the highway, he had a master key. He had been inside their rooms while they slept, standing right over them in the dark. And they never caught him.